The MENA Talks, a podcast series by the BIC on the Middle East and North Africa. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will explore underlying historical, economic, social and political drivers behind today's systemic issues in the MENA region. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Hello and welcome to our newest episode of the MENA Talks podcast. My name is Elisa Chery. I'm a Middle East analyst with the Brussels International Center. And today I'm joined by Mr. Jean-Nicolas Beuze, the Yemen representative for the UNHCR, who is joining us from Sana'a. Jean-Nicolas, thank you for being here and welcome.
Good morning, Elisa. I'm very pleased to be part of this series of the Brussels International Center.
Thank you. So today we are going to discuss a kind of a topic from an ongoing exploration of research that I have been going through in the past years. And it's an update from a publication that was out in the end of June on the injustices against aid workers in Yemen. So over the past years of the conflict in Yemen, we've seen an increasing number of attacks on aid workers in the country, compromising the safety of the workers, but also the ability of these workers to carry out their job and deliver the much needed aid to millions of people around the country. So what are some of the greatest concerns in your work surrounding the safety of aid workers?
So there's different factors which influence the safety and security of aid workers when we operate in a context like Yemen, but it's true in any context where there is a conflict. The first one I would like to mention is really the conflict itself. The fact that, for example, in Yemen, you have close to 50% of the informal settlement hosting internally displaced population, which are within 5 kilometers of an active front line. So that's definitely an element to take into consideration when you decide to send teams on the ground to deliver assistance, to do needs assessment, and so on and so forth, because you are putting yourself and your colleagues at risk of being the collateral damage of the conflict. 5 kilometers, when people are shooting, bombing, shelling each other, you can well imagine that this is a risk that we shall not take, except if it's to provide survival means to the population and under certain circumstances. The second point, which is very complicated in a country like Yemen, is all the hurdles, the obstacles which are being put by the authorities on the ground for us to remain capable of reaching out in an independent and objective manner the population that we serve. So it starts with being denied visa for international staff to enter into the country. It goes on into being denied field mission because you don't get the security clearance from the authorities on the ground, and so on and so forth. And that is not particular to Yemen, but it's true, as you mentioned, that Yemen probably is one of, if not the most non-permissive operational environment that we witness currently. It's extremely difficult to organize this mission to the ground. It's extremely difficult to ensure that when we do needs assessment, they are made completely independent from the authorities, including the tribal leaders or the community leaders on the ground. And that when we do deliver assistance, we make sure that the assistance reach the most needy, because there's always risk, like anywhere else in the world, of aid diversion. Whether it's cash money, which is distributed, or blankets and buckets, we don't want that assistance to end into the wrong hands, meaning military or armed groups, because this is assistance which is reserved entirely for civilians. So those are the two elements I would like to mention as a starting point: the conflict on one side, and then the obstacles or the hurdles that can be put by the authorities on the ground in our own access to the population in need.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the logistical challenges that you mentioned was something that I focused a lot on in the paper, which kind of leads me into my next question of what are some of the different impacts for Yemeni nationals who work in the humanitarian aid sector compared to their colleagues who are not from Yemen, their foreign counterparts?
It's an important question, and it's one that we often look at in devising our strategies, our approaches on the ground. Is it better to use national national NGOs, or is it better to use international NGOs? Is it better to use national staff within those NGOs or international staff? It's very difficult to give a blanket response because I think it really depends a lot on the type of intervention and the context. Certainly, anything which relates to protection, gender-based violence, child protection, domestic violence, and so on and so forth, may be construed, if it's promoted or if it's led by an international staff, as not being in line with the Yemeni social and cultural values, or those who are being portrayed by the authorities as the Yemeni values. And therefore, the access by an international staff to some populations may be constrained by the perception that the authorities or this population themselves have of those foreigners. In that respect, probably national colleagues may be better position to have those kind of conversation on what is seen in those societies as sensitive topics that relate to the protection of women, of children, of minority groups, of persons with disabilities, elderly person, and so on. Now, some other intervention requires a certain degree of technical knowledge that is not necessarily available within the national partners or the national NGOs. If you think about some techniques related to water, to shelter, to the implementation of or the management of informal settlements where IDPs, internally displaced, gather, it's true that international expertise is required, no doubt about that. Now, the question is, how do we transfer this knowledge to the national partners so that eventually they have more access to the population? And it's part of the commitment of the international NGOs and of the UN to transfer the knowledge to the national partners, to build the capacities of domestic first-line responders. So I think it's difficult to respond to your question in a general manner because it really depends on the type of intervention, the location. Some of those populations that are in need in Yemen, but I also work in Afghanistan. It's the same in Democratic Republic of Congo, where I also work, are in very remote locations. And it's very difficult for some of the international staff actually to reach those locations, and therefore relying on local partners, NGOs, is much more practical, much more effective in terms of logistic and financially much more cost efficient to go to those very remote locations on our national partners and local NGOs. I mean, even community-based organizations, CBOs.
Okay, great. So there's kind of this codependence and it depends on the context, but it's important to work both with locals and with the expertise of international staff.
Totally. We need to, there is a commitment from the Istanbul conference a few years ago on humanitarian reform for the international community to really beef up, capacitate the response of the national partners. And in the case of UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, this is a commitment we have really taken very seriously. I must say that in Yemen, more than 90% of our partners are national, domestic, or even local, very local NGOs. It comes with a certain responsibility, because it also means that you need to train the partners, you need to capacitate them in putting together a budget or a programmatic response. It also comes with additional oversight, because while we trust our national partners, we need to also ensure that there is no aid diversion at their own level. And therefore, it requires for those international partners, the UN or international NGOs, to have more control, more oversight, more project control capacity to support the implementation of those programs by national partners. But this is totally doable. And even if it's extra work, I think this is, everybody thinks this is not an excuse not to transfer the skills and the knowledge to the local partners.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's really important. Some of the contacts that I have made from local people within Yemen appreciate the support of the international community, but also know that it's really important for them to build their own presence and their own sustainability within the country. Hopefully that can remain within like a post-conflict setting as well.
Exactly, because the end game is not for the United Nations or the international NGOs to remain in the country. The end game is really to build the capacity of the public services, but also the civil society, to take care of their own national by themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So then how would you encourage the international community to engage with or assist aid workers in Yemen, whether they're nationals or the international organizations that are working in the country, both to ensure their safety, but also to ensure that the aid work is actually being carried out in a proper function?
In terms of the safety, the first thing which comes to mind is really security training, security awareness training. I think it's difficult sometimes, both for international and national colleagues, to always weigh in on the risk that they are taking. We tend, after a certain while, to be, in a way, complacent with the environment in which we operate. We don't notice anymore the bomb that are being dropped. We don't always look at the map to make sure that wherever we go is not too close to an active front line. We don't always take the necessary precaution of having 2-3 vehicles in a convoy, so that if there is a problem, there's still a chance to exit in a safe manner from any location if there is a problem with one vehicle. So all those little details are critical when you are faced with a security incident. So I think there is a lot of, and especially for the national colleagues and the national partners who have been living for 7 years in this context and who have to survive, and therefore have built a certain level of resilience. But sometimes I notice, at least personally, that these partners, and myself included, become a bit too light on the security aspect. So security awareness training, absolutely critical, but we need also to give them the means to abide by the security rules. We need to help them purchase armored vehicles if armored vehicles are required, so that they don't get injured when they go on mission. I think that there's also a real role for the United Nations, and in particular the Humanitarian Coordinator on the ground and OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, to protect the NGOs, international and national, against any kind of interferences by the authorities. We need to shield them away. They have a lot that they can do on their own. They know their authorities. They know how to deal with them. They are strong enough, very often stronger than the UN, I would say, to make an argument with their own authorities to justify why they are having certain programmatic intervention. But at the end of the day, I think there's also an accountability from the United Nations, which represent the international community, to protect national partners from interference or even harassment when it comes to them dealing with sensitive issues. Again, I will mention protection issues, everything which relate to women and children in a context like Yemen, like in many other countries. Those are difficult conversations to have with the authorities. And there, I think we need to help the national partners to make an argument on universal values, on universal human rights norms and principles and practices, so that we don't run the risk of using local arguments, socioeconomic norms and practices to undermine the realization of the rights of the people on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the aspects that I focused on in this paper that I just published was also the legal aspect of this, because there is international humanitarian law that has to be upheld. And of course, Yemen has ratified many of those conventions and is responsible for upholding, these laws under international humanitarian law. How is that challenging in your work when you see kind of a breach in this humanitarian law? Who do you call on to ensure that it's being upheld, or how can it be upheld if possible?
That's one part of the job which is really interesting, is really the diplomatic negotiation that you need to have with the authorities to ensure that indeed all those humanitarian principles or norms are being upheld in all circumstances. Very difficult because IHL, as you know, is also very nuanced vis-a-vis some of those issues. To take one example, which everybody knows, hospitals are protected from any attacks and any, and therefore the parties to the conflict really need to make all the efforts necessary not to have any collateral damage impacting a hospital and the patients in the hospital. However, if one armed group or the armed forces decide to launch an attack from an hospital, then the protection of this hospital as a civilian object is lost. And it becomes, it may, under certain circumstances, you still have to weigh the risk of the impact on the civilian population as opposed to the military personnel in the hospital, but may become a legitimate target under humanitarian law, international humanitarian law. So all those nuances are very difficult to assess on the ground. Because you don't have always the information in a timely manner, or you don't always have accurate information, or it's difficult to triangulate this information. And this is the basis for you to start an argument with the parties to the conflict. If you don't have the information correct, you are going to enter into those negotiations in a very weak position. So the challenge is really to gather the information, to analyze this information, and then to draw the conclusion based on international norms and practices, and then engage with arguments, valid arguments with the parties to the conflict. It's often we tend to forget that those conflicts are very localized. And therefore, there's not necessarily a chain of command, and you cannot necessarily go to the focal point of the armed group number 33 and speak to one single person to make your argument and hope that eventually the whole chain of command will mean that the behavior of the armed forces or the armed groups on the ground will change. So what I'm trying to say here is that it really requires one-on-one discussion, negotiation usually very local, at a localized level, with the one in charge on the ground in the location where you are trying to make a change. One of the main issues that we deal with as humanitarian is unimpeded access. So meaning access on our own terms to the population in need. And that again requires often negotiation with somebody at a checkpoint or somebody in the local office representing the authorities, so that they give you the security green light to pass a certain road or to cross a certain bridge, and so on and so forth. So this is often very time consuming. It's done by the team on a case by case, almost on a daily basis, to make sure that we can access those populations in a safe manner for ourselves, in a safe manner for the people we serve, but also in a manner which upholds the humanitarian principle that we remain neutral, independent in our assessment of the need and in the delivery of the assistance. Not an easy job.
So the long story short is that it's very complicated.
Very.
Okay, so I want to switch directions a little bit because, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has deeply affected the ability of aid agencies to carry out their work in Yemen and everywhere around the world. Can you describe some of the changes that have been implemented since the start of the pandemic and some of the impacts the pandemic has had and continues to have on aid work in Yemen?
Yes, and I will start by a caveat saying that really, as I've said several times on Twitter in particular, the COVID-19 is really not the top priority for the population in Yemen. There are many more concerns and many more reasons to worry than the COVID-19. There was earlier this year a risk of famine for quite a substantive number of Yemeni, in particular Yemeni displaced, who are 4 times more at risk of being hungry than the rest of the population. There is cholera, chikungunya, dengue fever, and other communicable diseases which are really widespread and endemic in Yemen. There's very little access to healthcare because half of the health facilities have been destroyed by the conflict. And anyway, there is very little medication and expertise in terms of doctors and nurses to treat many of the disease, which are disease or injuries including from the conflict, that would be treatable easily in another context. So COVID-19 has not been the priority of the population. On the other end, there were very limited options for the population to protect itself from COVID-19. People live 2 or 3 generations and sometimes share with other families very small spaces. So you cannot do physical distancing. People do not have money under the mattress or at the bank. They need to go out and to work every day because that's the only way they can feed their children or themselves at night. It's with the money that they would have collected during the day. It's daily wages. A number of people live in conditions where there is no potable water or running water from a tap. So washing your hands becomes very difficult. And when you are extremely poor, between buying some soap or buying some rice, you will always choose buying some rice because you are going to feed yourself and your children before you are going to wash your hands. So those 2 elements are important to keep in mind, because I know that from the West, it has been difficult to understand that the COVID-19 may not have been the major concern for the population. However, it was a concern for the humanitarian partners because we didn't want to expose our own staff or the people we serve to the coronavirus. And therefore, we had to modify a lot of our intervention. Instead of doing distribution on a site where everybody comes to pick up the mattresses, the tents, or the soap, or whatever, or even the cash at the bank, we had to really space completely those distribution. So instead of doing it in 2 days, we will do it in 8 days. So it has an increased cost. It has an increased number of staff getting involved in those distribution. Instead of doing focus group or group therapy where people will come together and share their experiences, we had to move to one-on-one psychosocial first aid. Again, far more difficult in terms of the logistic because it requires much more staff, and we can do much less session in a day than if you do a group therapy. And by the way, the group therapy is often much more valuable for the people themselves than a one-on-one, which is something people are not very comfortable with in the context of Yemen. At the bank, for example, for our cash assistance, we put in place a hand washing station, additional information about the COVID-19 and the prevention measures that can eventually be taken. But we have also space, the time during which families can come to retrieve their cash. Instead of having only 1 week distribution, we turn it into 2 weeks. Again, an increased cost. So all those little details, which are critically important, made our life even far more complicated in an operational environment, which was already extremely complicated. So the COVID-19 was, as I tend to say to my colleagues, really the cherry on the cake that was really not needed.
I can't imagine how difficult it is, but also the first point that you mentioned, that these people are not as concerned about COVID-19 as we are here, in Europe and in the West, because they've got much larger problems to worry about on top of all of the other health concerns that already exist within the context of the conflict and all of the other humanitarian issues.
And one thing that I also, and I'm not an expert on the issue, so maybe some of the listeners of this podcast will challenge me later on, but death is completely integrated in the daily life of the Yemeni, much more than in our Western societies. A number of children don't survive at birth. A number of mothers don't survive when they give birth. There is a conflict, so people get killed or maimed and injured in the conflict. People die because a number of disease and injuries that are easily treatable are not treatable in Yemen because of the lack of access to quality health services. A number of people have really difficulties feeding their young children, and therefore there is a high mortality amongst infants, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the whole approach, I would say, to the COVID-19 and the pandemic by the Yemeni, at least what I have noticed with my own colleagues, but also all the internally displaced persons that I've met on a regular basis, was completely different from what I could hear of my family and friends in Europe. The outlook on what are the risks, what risk do we take, but also what are the consequences of getting COVID were completely different in the context of Yemen and in Europe.
It's very interesting what you said about how people view death differently. Do you think that's mostly because the conflict, or also just because of like the historical lack of resources, if I can say that?
Yeah. No, I think it's really the latter. I mean, the conflict has added another layers, but it's really years or decades of deprivation which have made life very difficult to sustain, that has created this resilience that the Yemeni population and many other populations in the world have with respect to those communicable disease or a pandemic like COVID-19. I also think that there is a high belief in God. There's a strong roots in the religion, in Islam, in the case of Yemen, which also helps those populations deal with life and death in a different manner that we may have in the Western world, at least for those who do not necessarily have a strong belief in strong religious belief. You often hear IDPs when you ask them, so how are you going to manage X, Y, Z, whether it's a lack of food or whether it's a lack of medication for the grandparents or a child born with disabilities? And the response is, God will provide. We leave that in the hands of God. And it's a strong belief. It's not a formula that people say without believing it. It's not something that they said to reassure. It's probably something they said to reassure themselves, but it's a strong belief that there will be a solution. God will provide.
Yeah, absolutely. It's much different here in Europe, but there's a little beauty in the way that people have this kind of belief and this connection to a higher power.
Yes.
Okay, so my final question is kind of more broad. I guess last week on the 6th of August, the UN Secretary General appointed Hans Grundberg from Sweden to be the newest UN Special Envoy to Yemen. Mr. Grundberg is a career diplomat with a strong background in the Middle East. Are you hopeful of his new appointment? And what are some of the challenges that Mr. Grundberg will be confronted with in his new position?
I'm always hopeful that at the end of the day, peace will prevail and that human rights, rule of law, justice, accountability will prevail in a context like Yemen. Otherwise, I think I would have chosen a different career. And I think it's important that we collectively remain hopeful for solution in Yemen. I think the appointment of a new special envoy is certainly a step in the right direction, or a step which was required by the circumstances. However, I think that there is a lot of hurdles or obstacles in front of this special envoy, and anybody else. There's also a special envoy from the US. There's different peace initiative going around. Oman, one of the neighboring countries, has been really on the forefront of trying to bring parties to the conflict to the negotiating table. So I wish, all those people have a huge task ahead of them. I think in the case of Yemen, what we tend to forget is the fact that on top of an international conflict, because we have the Saudi-led coalition fighting against the Houthi in Sana'a, we have the Houthi or the de facto authorities against the internationally recognized government, which is in Aden. We have the Southern Transitional Council in the south of the country, which is fighting against both the Houthi and the internationally recognized government. I think in addition to these layers of the conflict, one tends to forget that there's really a domestic dimension, one which is really of as far as I understand, of a tribal nature. And here I must say, without undermining all the efforts from the United Nations and the special envoys, it requires, in my view, a different type of mediator. We really need to, again, a bit like with the international NGOs and the national NGOs, we need to build on the national capacities. There's a network of women who are working to help the exchange of prisoners and to make peace deal at the local level. I believe very much in those initiatives, much more than in the big international initiative, which end up in meetings in foreign land and so on. I think we need really to localize the discussion about peace. I think we need to engage those actors on the ground, tribal leaders, women activists, minority groups, and so on and so forth, perhaps former soldiers, former child soldiers who have been released. Because at the end of the day, they are the ones who can and who should and who will make peace. And they need to feel that they are being heard, that their grievances are being heard, that the solutions which are found are localized, are real for those people. We need to make sure that we tend to forget, but one of the main dividend of peace is economic ones. People want to get something out of the peace. There's a lot of money which is being made in a war, in a conflict. There's a lot of people who benefit from the conflict. And therefore, we really need to find solutions which will give a better life to a wide range, to everybody in Yemen, taking into consideration, in particular, those who are making big money now from the conflict, so that they get something, but that it is not at the detriment of others, and certainly not of the victims and the survivors.
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. To your first point, I hope that peace prevails, because I too believe that. All right, so we could continue talking all day. I have so many questions, but I think this is a good point to wrap up on. So Jean-Nicolas, how can people keep up with your work, with the work of the UNHCR, and continue to support the cause that the international institutions are carrying out in Yemen?
I am a big fan of social media. So follow me on my Twitter. It's JNBEUZE. You have a lot of access to information on the different websites of the United Nations in Yemen, but also the international NGOs and think tanks like the Brussels International Centers. So you have plenty of access to information. It's important for people who are listening to us today, whether in Brussels or in Europe, to keep informed and to keep advocating.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jean-Nicolas. And we'll be sure to tag you when we post this on social media. So yes, thank you again. And for our listeners, this is Elisa Chery from the Brussels International Center, joined by Jean-Nicolas for our MENA Talks podcast. So thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks, and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and North Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Center.